Thanks so much, John. As is seasonally appropriate, I'm on the edge of a cold, so forgive me for having my water bottle with me. And you'll notice if you've ever heard me speak before, my voice is about sort of an octave lower than it usually is, because I'm kind of gravelly today, but hopefully the water will see me through. As John mentioned, my eldest daughter, Miranda, is with me today. When my second daughter, Eliza, was about 5, it was about this time of year, and I was sitting with her as a good Christian mother does, and I was reading to her about the Christmas story. And we're sitting there, we have a children's Bible, and I'm reading to her about this angel called Gabriel, who appeared to this most likely teenage girl named Mary, and told her that she was going to give birth, miraculously, to the very Son of God. And my 5-year-old daughter looked at me and she said, "I don't believe that." And I thought, oh, okay, this is new. Miranda, my firstborn, had sort of lapped up everything that I had told her about Jesus. And Eliza, my secondborn, was exercising a healthy degree of skepticism, age 5. And so I thought, oh, I'm just going to kind of figure out what she doesn't believe. So I said, okay, so do you believe that there is a God who made the universe? She said, yeah, and I believe that. And I said, okay, do you believe that Jesus is God's son? She said, yeah, I believe that. I said, did you believe that he came to die for you and that he rose it? She said, yeah. Turned out it was the angel. She was like, everything else is fine, but the angel, I don't buy the angel. And you can understand that from a 5-year-old's perspective, because when we think of angels, we think of like a little sort of fairy on the top of the Christmas tree. And we never did Santa. She absolutely knew Santa wasn't real. In fact, age 5, she went into a class and she told all her friends that Santa wasn't real, but Jesus was. And I thought, I kind of love that energy, but also I don't know that that's what the other parents want their kids to be told. But for her, the idea of an angel was just not credible. And my guess is there are some in the room tonight who are thinking, yeah, I understand angels are not believable. And frankly, the idea of a virgin giving birth to God's only son, also in the not believable category. It's not just we sort of need to peel the angel out of the story and then everything's fine. We've got all sorts of crazy stuff happening here. And tonight, in the time that my voice allows, I want to look at some of the crazy claims of Christmas. And I want to look at them from the perspective of 4 problems that we as 21st century educated scientific Westerners might have when it comes to the believability of the Christmas story. So number 1, the problem of science. Number 2 is going to be the problem of scripture. Number 3, the problem of sophistication. And number 4, the problem of sin. So I think our first problem, as we think about the possibility that the Christmas story is believable, is what I'm calling the problem of science. Now, I'm guessing there are some in this room, probably many in this city, who if you went up to them and you said, hey, great news, a virgin gave birth 2,000 years ago, they'd say, do you know what? We know from the discoveries of modern science that virgins don't give birth. In fact, we know from the discoveries of modern science that miracles in general are just not credible. I mean, sure, 2,000 years ago, people believed in miracles, but today, we know how the universe works. We don't need sort of miraculous explanations for the natural world like people did back then. And so the Christmas story is sort of dead in the water from a scientific perspective. And I can understand why some people take that view. My fellow countryman, Richard Dawkins, and some of the other kind of new atheist authors who were sort of most active a couple of decades ago, very much had the message for us that the more you understand of science, the less need there is for God. And in fact, the whole history of the last 400 years has been this sort of fight between science and Christianity, where scientists win victory after victory after victory, while these poor sort of benighted Christians retreat. And so from many people's perspective, miracles is one of the things that you just have to let go of if you're holding on to modern science. But there are a couple of problems with that approach. One is that if you look at the history of science, the people who first developed what we now call science, and my guess is there are some scientists in the room who know this much better than I do, but the people who first sort of developed what we now call science weren't seeing it as an alternative hypothesis to belief in a creator God or the possibility of miracles. They actually were coming up with what we now call science precisely because they believed in the God of the Bible. The person who I think explains this best is a professor at Princeton named Hans Halvorsen. He's a professor of mathematics and philosophy there. And he explained that the framers of the modern scientific revolution, sort of 400 years ago, looked at their Bibles, and they believed from their Bibles that there is one God who made the whole universe. And that this God is an orderly, law-giving kind of God, because we have these consistent sort of laws, moral laws that God gives in the Bible. And he's a rational God with a consistent character. And so they thought, if this one God made the universe, then maybe he made it according to rational, consistent principles that we, as creatures, according to the Bible, made in God's own image, might be able to discern. But because the God of the Bible is also presented as completely free, he could have made the universe in any way he wanted. And so the only way to find out what these laws of the universe are is to actually go and look. We need to do experiments. We can't just sort of sit around in our armchairs imagining how God might have made the universe. So if you look back at the origins of the modern scientific method, you don't find a bunch of atheists sort of coming up with their ways to disprove a creator God. You actually find people who are seeking to understand the work of this creator God. As what one of the early pioneers of the scientific revolution put it, they were sort of thinking God's thoughts after him. So it's not actually true that in order to embrace science, we need to sort of eliminate the possibility of a creator God. And it's also not true that believing in the discoveries of modern science eliminates the possibility of miracles. I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm a short walk from MIT, the kind of high temple of science in this country. And at MIT, there are dozens of Christian professors who are leading experts in their various fields. And one of them, a friend of mine, Ian Hutchinson, who's also from the UK. I promise I do listen to people who aren't from the UK as well, but, got to pay attention to my fellow countrymen. He didn't grow up in a Christian family. He actually became a Christian when he was an undergrad at Cambridge University. He was baptized on his 21st birthday in the chapel of King's College in Cambridge. And he explained in a book a few years ago that actually the premise of Christianity in relation to science is not that in order for God to intervene in the world, he sort of needs to pop in at various moments, and otherwise sort of science is taking care of itself. It's actually that God is sustaining the entire universe all the time. And so when we're looking at something that we might call a miracle, what we're talking about is God sustaining his universe in a different way than usual. It's not the God has sort of, as some people have put it, like wound up the universe like a clock and then sort of walked off and said, back in a few billion years' time. It's actually that if the Bible is true, then God is sustaining the whole universe at all times. And the point of the scientific method is to look at things that are repeatable and consistent, to sort of see what natural causes we can find for natural phenomena in the scientific world. And a miracle, kind of by definition, is not a repeatable occurrence. The Bible's claim that Jesus was born of a virgin was not a claim to say, oh, well, actually, in general, we think that babies are born of virgins. It was a very specific moment where God was doing something quite extraordinary. And if you think about it, I can understand some people say, look, I'm okay with the idea that there is a God. Like maybe there's a God who made the universe. But a virgin birth, like a sort of specific miracle like that, feels like a supernatural bridge too far. I can understand that feeling. But if we step back and think about it for a minute, if there is a God who made the universe, then creating one particular human in a virgin's womb in a specific and different way is child's play. It's a bit like saying, well, I know Simone Biles is the greatest gymnast of all time, but I bet she can't do a somersault. Like, it's actually a trivial thing for God to be able to work a miracle within his creation. So whereas the problem of science when it comes to the crazy, miraculous claims of the Christmas story might seem like a deal breaker, I think actually even some of the smartest scientific minds today would look at the Christmas story and say, yeah, because I believe there is in fact a God who made this universe, and it's the workings of that God in the universe that I'm studying in the lab day by day, it's actually not off the table for me to believe that God, 2,000 years ago, became a human being in the person of Jesus Christ, and that there was a miraculous virgin birth. So that's the problem of science. The second problem I think we can legitimately have when it comes to the Christmas story is what I'm calling the problem of Scripture. Now, probably many of us know, in the Bible there are 4 biographies of Jesus, the so-called Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And if you read through each of those 4 accounts of Jesus' life, you'll notice that only 2 of them mention Jesus' sort of supernatural origins, Matthew's Gospel and Luke's Gospel. And in fact, Mark's Gospel, which pretty much all New Testament scholars think was written first, most likely between sort of 35 and 45 years after Jesus' death, Mark's Gospel doesn't reference Jesus' miraculous conception and birth, and nor does John's Gospel. So some people might say, well, isn't it interesting that the first Gospel to be written down didn't mention this, and then these 2 Gospels, Matthew and Luke, that were written later on, kind of came up with this idea, this sort of origin myth of Jesus, this strange thought that he might have been conceived of a virgin. And again, I can see why that seems plausible at first. There are a few things that we need to bear in mind. The first is that whereas Mark's Gospel doesn't specifically reference Jesus' divine origins in the same way, and his sort of birth narrative, Mark's Gospel is clear from the first that the Jesus that it's describing is the Son of God. And you see that you can just read through the first chapter of Mark's Gospel, and that will slap you straight in the face. And if you read John's Gospel, which again, most probably written last, doesn't mention Jesus' birth narrative in the same way, begins with this extraordinary declaration of who Jesus is. John, rather than going back to the beginning of Jesus' life on earth, goes back to the beginning before all time and says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. And John there is talking about this first century Jewish man, Jesus of Nazareth, as this Word. So if we look at all 4 of the Gospels, each of them is very clearly presenting to us Jesus as the very Son of God. But then you might say, well, okay, fine. So these 4 supposed biographies of Jesus all seem to be making this claim that he is divine, but they were written down, even the earliest one, like decades after the events they're recording. You know, you might say, I don't remember what I had for breakfast last Tuesday. How could you expect people to remember with such detailed precision things that happened decades ago? And again, I think that's a reasonable question for us to have. And depending on how old you are in this room, and I'm glad we've got quite the range of ages, for some people in this room, you couldn't possibly remember things that happened 35 years ago because you weren't alive. So, for example, my daughter Miranda is 14. She's got no hope of remembering things even that happened 20 years ago. And for her, 35 years probably sounds like an everlasting of everlastings. But there'll be other people in this room for whom 35 years ago, actually, there are plenty of things that you remember from 35, 45, 55, perhaps even 60 years ago. Now, of course, we don't remember everything that happened to us, but we remember the life-changing experiences. We remember the conversations that completely changed us. We remember the moments that shaped and formed who we are. And the 4 Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were all written well within the lifetimes of eyewitnesses of this first century Jewish rabbi known as Jesus of Nazareth. And they're written by people who had the life-changing experience of meeting Jesus. In fact, many of these people traveled around with Jesus, and it was their full-time job to listen to his teachings, to watch what he was doing, to remember his sayings, and then they were kind of commissioned to tell those stories after Jesus' death and claimed resurrection. Now, again, we don't remember everything that happened to us decades ago. But if you had spent 3 years walking around the countryside with Jesus, hearing what he was teaching, seeing what he was doing, listening and trying to understand what he was saying, and if it wasn't just you, but in fact, sort of dozens of you, I mean, we hear about in the Gospels these sort of 12 particular chosen Jewish men, the 12 disciples or apostles, they're sometimes called, who kind of represent the 12 tribes of Israel from the Old Testament. But actually, Jesus had a larger group of disciples that traveled around with him as well, including many women, who Luke's Gospel particularly highlights. And all of these people were listening to what Jesus was saying and what he was doing, recording the events of his life. And so when we read the Gospel accounts, it's not like the kind of telephone game, which is an analogy that sometimes skeptical authors use, where, you know, that game where you sort of, one person whispers a message to the next person, who whispers it to the next person, you go round and round and round, and then you kind of laugh at the end at how different the message was from the beginning to the end. It's actually not like that, because there was this whole kind of group of people who were telling the stories of Jesus. It wasn't just dependent on one person passing on to one person, passing on to one person, finally written down. The gospel authors are drawing on the eyewitness testimony of many people who traveled around with this man. But what about these early narratives, the stories that we have in Luke's gospel and in Matthew's gospel that go right back to the very beginning to Jesus' miraculous conception? Well, there in Luke's gospel, we are dependent on the story of one particular witness, Mary, the mother of Jesus. Again, most likely a teenage girl, engaged but not yet married, seemingly relatively poor, sort of lower socioeconomic status. And she hears this message from this angel. Now Mary, far from it being a kind of fairy on top of a Christmas tree experience for Mary, Mary had the same reaction to this angel that pretty much everyone who encounters an angel in the Bible has, and that is she's completely terrified. The first thing angels always have to say in the Bible is like, don't be afraid, because they're terrified. They're sort of these ethereal warrior beings sent by God. I mean, it's no joke to meet an angel. And Mary had this extraordinary encounter with this angel who told her that she was going to give birth to the Son of the Most High God. He told her that Jesus, her son, was going to be a king taking over from King David, the greatest king of the Old Testament, and that he would reign sort of forever. These wild claims that Mary received. And yes, to know that conversation that she had with the angel Gabriel, we are dependent only on her testimony. But it's a story that's, even though it's wild, it's actually very consistent with the other stories that we hear about Jesus later in his life. In Matthew's gospel, we hear it kind of more from the perspective of Joseph, Jesus' adoptive father, who has a dream of an angel where he's told about this boy who Mary is going to conceive. So we get these two kind of angles on the story from Matthew and from Luke. But both of them, again, written well within the lifetimes of the people who first told those stories, the people most closely involved with them. And again, one of the fascinating things, if you read through the gospel accounts, is that you'll find that some of the key moments in Jesus' life in all four of the gospels are dependent on the eyewitness testimony of women. Now, it's not really striking to us because it's kind of obvious to us that women's testimony is just as good as man's. But at that time and in that culture, the testimony of women was not seen as reliable as men. In fact, it would be quite easy to dismiss the testimony of women when it came not only to Jesus' miraculous birth, but also to the extraordinary miracle at the end of Jesus' life of his claimed resurrection from the dead. And I think it's one of the features in the Gospels that testify to their truthfulness, or at least to the fact that we should take them very seriously, that in all four of the Gospels, that claimed resurrection is first witnessed by women. Perhaps the least kind of credible witnesses that the authors could have ventured. You have to ask yourself, well, why are they giving us this sort of less impressive sounding testimony, other than the fact that that maybe is what actually happened. Maybe Jesus did, in fact, reveal himself first to some of his female followers. So when it comes to the problem of Scripture, that maybe what we have is sort of mythological accounts written about Jesus sort of way after anyone who could really have known what happened. I think when you look more closely, actually, the gospel accounts of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, including the birth narratives of Jesus in Matthew and Luke, actually deserve a closer scrutiny than that. We can't just dismiss them. So it's the problem of science, the problem of Scripture. The third problem is what I'm calling the problem of sophistication. Now, I think there'll probably be some who are skeptical of the Christmas story who would say, look, I understand that 2,000 years ago, people were, frankly, gullible enough to believe in this kind of story. You know, people believed in all sorts of weird and wonderful things back then. And people today would go one of two ways with that. Some people say, you know, today I'm just too educated, too scientifically minded, too sort of skeptical of these kinds of stories to really take the Christmas story seriously. Other people would say, well, if you look around the world today, you see so many different world religions, all claiming these kind of crazy, miraculous claims. And so how are we to say that there's one true religion, that there is just sort of one story is true and the others are somehow not true? It seems like a very arrogant posture to say, well, Christianity is true with its wild claims about Jesus being born of a virgin and being the Son of God, but, for example, Islam is not true, or Hinduism is not true, or Buddhism is not true. And I think we have a sort of problem of sophistication where it's easy for many in our culture today to say, because I can see that there are these different truth claims being made, I don't actually need to buy into any of them. In fact, I would feel sort of unsophisticated buying into just one of them. I can say, I don't want to say they're not true, but I'm not going to stake my life or my kind of identity on any one of these. The story that sometimes gets told is of the sort of parable of an elephant walking into a village where everybody in that village happens to be blind. And the different people from the village go up to the elephant, and one guy touches the elephant's leg, and he says, oh, I think this elephant is it's kind of like a wall. I'm pressing against it, it doesn't go anywhere, it's like a wall. And another guy says, no, this is like a snake because he's holding the elephant's trunk. Somebody else says, no, it's like a spear because he's holding the elephant's horn. And this story is told to say, if we look at the different world religions today, we can kind of say that they're all grasping at different elements of the truth. And the really interesting thing about that story is that the person telling the story is the one person who isn't blind, right? I mean, essentially what you're saying there is all these people making these different religious truth claims and thinking that they aren't compatible. They're like these blind people trying to figure out what the elephant is actually like, whereas here I am, sophisticated person over here, looking at them and thinking, oh, isn't it sweet? Like they think they have the truth, when in fact they've just got a piece of the truth. I think it's ultimately a lot more respectful to people who are seriously convinced of one of the great world religions to take what they're saying seriously enough to say, okay, you're making a real claim on truth, and it's either true or it isn't. I actually don't think it's respectful if I say to a Muslim friend, I'm not going to take your different beliefs seriously enough to recognize where they conflict with mine. Or likewise with a Jewish or a Buddhist friend. Instead, I think the most respectful thing we can do as we engage with people with different religious beliefs is to listen carefully to what they're saying and to consider carefully whether their claim of truth might actually be true. So there's this idea that's common in the modern world, especially in the West, which is that there's this kind of default secular position, which is the view from nowhere, the kind of person who can see looking at all the blind people with the elephant, and that I'm sort of standing on this solid secular ground, and I need an awful lot of convincing to step onto any of these sort of crazy religious islands that are being presented to me. And if that's the ground you think you're standing on, then it's understandable. I mean, Christianity along with any of these other world religions, has some crazy ideas. I believe there was a first century Jewish rabbi who died on a cross and was raised to life on the third day afterwards. I believe that the whole of human history revolves around this guy. I believe that he was the one who made the universe from the very beginning. I mean, these are wild claims. And if you're standing on some sort of perfectly solid, neutral, secular ground, why do you need to jump into this weird and wonderful world of Christianity? The problem is actually, if you're standing there and you look down at your feet, you'll find the ground you're standing on is not half as solid as you might have thought. And most likely you'll find that you do actually have a whole lot of universalizing beliefs. A whole lot of beliefs that can't be verified by science, but that you hold to be universal truths. So, for example, my guess is that everybody in this room and everybody, if you were to sort of knock on doors in Chicago and you were to ask people, hey, do you think that rape is morally wrong, regardless of where you are in the world or what your kind of cultural tradition is? My guess is most people say, yeah, no, I think rape is actually morally wrong, and that's a universal truth. Or if you were to say to somebody, do you think that men and women are fundamentally equal in value? I think probably everybody in this room and pretty much everyone in Chicago would say, yeah, I mean, that's just basic moral common sense, isn't it? Of course men and women are equally morally valuable. If you say, well, how about poor people? Do you think rich people are more important and valuable than poor people? They say, well, no, I think all human beings are equally morally valuable. That's a self-evident truth. Well, we'll find it, regardless of how we identify religiously, we probably all share a set of seemingly self-evident truths that we think are kind of universal. That it's not just that that's true in America, but go to Saudi Arabia and it's no longer true. And we tend to see them as basic moral common sense. But actually, if you look back at the history of ideas, you'll find that they're specifically Christian beliefs. Now, don't take my word for it. I'm going to quote another Brit. I'm sorry. I should have a quota of how many Brits I'm allowed to quote, but I don't, so I'm just going to keep doing it. There's a British historian called Tom Holland, not Spider-Man, but the historian Tom Holland. He wrote a really interesting book called Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. And in that book, he's looking at the history of the last 2,000 years in the West and Christianity's sort of role in that. And Tom Holland is not a Christian himself. He's coming from an agnostic perspective. But what he discovered in the course of research was that many of the kind of moral beliefs that he thought were self-evident truths, like that all human beings are fundamentally morally equal, like men and women are morally equal, like the strong and the rich and the powerful don't have the right to trample on the weak and the poor and the marginalized, these kinds of things, they turn out to be Christian beliefs. And he would say they're as Christian as the idea that Jesus rose from the dead. And that if we cut Christianity out, then we're a bit like sort of somebody sitting on a branch of a tree and soaring off that same branch. So what we find, if we're standing on what we feel like is this sort of neutral secular ground and looking somewhat sort of condescendingly at all those weird religious people with their crazy beliefs, we need to recognize we probably hold some crazy religious beliefs, we just don't realize it. And what happens when we take those beliefs away? When we finish cutting through that branch? Well, our whole moral framework has gone up in smoke. So that's problem number one. And actually, even our philosophical foundation for science has gone up in the same dumpster fire. I mentioned Hans Halvorsen, this Princeton professor. And he points out that not only is it the case that the people who first came up with what we now call science did so because they believed in a creator God, but that even today, he says that theism gives you a better philosophical foundation for science than atheism. In fact, he says atheism doesn't give you a philosophical foundation for science at all. The best that an atheist can say sort of philosophically is, I'm so glad science works. Now, don't get me wrong, there are many outstanding world-class atheist scientists. who are doing fantastic research. But when it comes to thinking through, well, what am I doing and why? Those questions which actually can't be answered with the tools of science are better answered from a Christian perspective than from an atheist perspective. So actually our sort of sophistication when it comes to science, our sophistication when it comes to looking at different kind of religious truth claims, our sophistication when it comes to ethics and this idea that there are universal sort of moral truths and universal human rights, all of these turn out to be surprisingly dependent on Christianity. And I would say, crazy as this sounds, that the claims of Jesus Christ are actually more believable today than they were 2,000 years ago. So if you think about it, when Jesus was born and lived and died, and his disciples were claiming that he'd risen from the dead 2,000 years ago, he had, a few dozen followers? At most a few hundred. Mary had been told that her son was going to be this great king who would reign on David's throne forever. She'd been told that her son was the very Son of God. Jesus, at the end of Matthew's gospel, had said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, therefore go and make disciples of all nations." I mean, that must have sounded ridiculous at the time. But if we look back now, from our vantage point almost 2,000 years later, Jesus' claim that he is in fact the one to whom all authority in heaven and earth has been given is looking a whole lot more plausible. Why do I say that? Well, if you look around the world today, Christianity is the largest global belief system. About 31% of the world identifies as Christian. To put that in proportion, about 15% of the world identifies as non-religious. So that includes atheists, agnostics, or people who just sort of check none on a census form. So there are twice as many people who identify as Christians around the world as people who identify as non-religious in one form or another. And Christianity is also the only truly kind of global belief system. It's not actually tied to any particular culture or ethnicity or country or sort of part of the world. And rather than shrinking, as people often sort of think that Christianity is, if we look around the world today, Christianity is continuing to grow. And so if you were trying to find a candidate for savior of the world, and you were just looking at the evidence around the world today, you would find that there are more people who would point to Jesus than anybody else, by far. There is now and has never been no emperor who holds more sway than Jesus. And again, I'm just setting aside whether or not you believe in the claims about Jesus. If we just look at the people who say, this is the person I'm following. And it's wild when you think about it. Jesus never led an army. He never sat on a throne. He never even wrote a book. And here we are 2,000 years later, with Jesus being unquestionably the most influential human being in all of human history, with almost a third of the human race claiming that they're his followers. This afternoon, I did a very strange thing. I got into a massive lump of metal, like hollowed out metal, and I sat down, crammed in with a whole bunch of other people, and we sat there in the expectation that this massive lump of metal would somehow get itself up into the air and carry us hundreds of miles from Boston to Chicago. Now, if you went back 2,000 years and you said to people, hey, do you know what? You could get into this massive lump of metal and it would fly you in the sky. They'd be like, what on earth? You are crazy. What kind of strange religious beliefs do you have? Today, we think that's just perfectly normal, right? We probably all got onto a plane and flown from A to B, and I don't think too much about the fact that this is a massive lump of metal flying in the sky, because it sort of makes sense to us now. We're used to it. This sort of aligns with our experience. And I think you could almost sort of play the same thing in the opposite direction if we go back 2,000 years and say to people, hey, do you know what? That man you just saw crucified, that man who you just saw completely humiliated and sort of stamped out under the jackboot of Rome, in 2,000 years' time, he's going to be the most influential human in all of human history. People have said, what are you talking about? That's ridiculous. So if we look at the claims of Christmas from the perspective of even our sort of modern sophistication, we might find that they are more plausible than we at first thought. So we've had the claims of science, the problem of science, the problem of scripture, the problem of sophistication. The last problem we have is what I'm calling the problem of sin. In Matthew's gospel, when Joseph is hearing about what's going to happen and who this child is going to be, who his not yet wife Mary is going to have, the angel says to him, you're going to call him Jesus because he will save his people from their sins. And I think if we look at the story of Christmas today, and especially if we actually read the gospel accounts of the story of Christmas and don't just sort of look at all the Christmas sort of frivolity around us in this season, then we'll find that we have a deeper problem with believing in Christmas than we maybe realized. Because central to the claims of Christmas is this idea that people like you and me actually need to be saved from our sin. And it's a profoundly offensive claim. I mean, it's pretty offensive. When my daughter went into her classroom at 5 and told all her friends that Jesus is real and Santa isn't, that was pretty offensive to a lot of the other families. They were sort of carefully curating this sort of happy childhood feeling for their children based on Santa, and my daughter was like, absolutely not. But the claim that you and I are so sinful, so kind of morally corrupted, so alienated from God, that we needed God's own Son to come into the world, and then, according to the Gospels, to die for us, to take the punishment that we deserve for our sin, that is actually a profoundly offensive claim. If you think about it, it means that we didn't just need a good moral teacher to help us to be even better. We didn't just need sort of a guru or a great example. We needed a savior. We were such lost causes that we needed God himself to become a human being and to die in our place so that we could be rescued. I mean, it's a very unflattering view of what you and I are like. I was talking with a young woman recently who is exploring Christianity with us in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or the People's Republic of Cambridge, as we sometimes call it. I think Boston is the third most secular or least church-going city in America. So we're sort of high up there. I think Seattle and Portland have us beat, but otherwise, we're pretty much the church-free zone. And one of the really interesting things that's been happening just in this last couple of years is seeing more and more people who have tried everything coming to our church and to our Bible study and saying, like, please tell me about Jesus. I've tried tarot cards, I've tried crystals, I've tried sleeping with men, I've tried sleeping with women, I've tried these various sort of spiritual practices, I've tried yoga, I've tried meditation, I've tried calling on sort of Amazon goddesses. There's all sorts of interesting pagan stuff going on up in Cambridge, maybe not in Chicago, but certainly up in Cambridge. And this young woman is one of the people who is thinking, I've tried all these things, and now I kind of want to know what you guys are saying about Jesus. And she said to me a few weeks ago, I always thought I was a good person, I just wasn't very good at it. I'm just not very good at being a good person. But now I'm sort of wondering if maybe I'm not a good person. And then actually what you're saying about Jesus coming and dying for my sins, like that's starting to actually make a little bit more sense. Because as long as we hold on to the idea that we're good people, we don't need Jesus. We're going to have no motivation to believe these wild claims about Jesus. Because if Jesus is a savior who has come to save his people from their sins, that means you and I are complete moral bankrupts who needed that kind of radical divine intervention. And honestly, I think that may be a reason for some of us why we don't, frankly, want to believe in Christmas. Why we could hear the most persuasive, I'm not saying that I've given the most persuasive arguments, but we could hear from the top scientists in the world, we could hear from the top historian in the world, we could hear from the top philosopher in the world, all telling us, do you know, actually, the Christmas story is much more believable than you might think. And if we're brutally honest, we don't want to believe it because it starts with an offensive message about us. But at the same time, as it's offensive, the Christmas story is also profoundly joyful. One of the first groups of people who got to hear the good news about Jesus after Mary and Joseph was a bunch of shepherds who were kind of the riffraff of that day. We have a very romanticized view of shepherds, but that wasn't the case then. Kind of on the lower level of the socioeconomic rung. And a bunch of shepherds got an announcement about Jesus. And they were told that this is good news of great joy for all the people, for people from all sorts of different racial or cultural or ethnic backgrounds, for people all around the world, that the coming of Jesus was actually good news of great joy. Because if the bad news of Christianity is that you and I are sufficiently sinful that we needed this radical intervention, we needed Jesus to come and die for us, to take the punishment for our sin, otherwise we will take the punishment for our sin when he returns, then the good news of Christianity is that Jesus loves us enough that he would do that. I don't know many people in this room well, but I'm willing to bet that all of us at heart want to be known and loved. And frankly, there's an extent to which we sort of have to trade those two things off a lot of the time. You know, I'll tell you certain things about myself that I think will make you like me more, but there are other things I'm going to kind of hide because I know that if you really knew that about me, you wouldn't be impressed at all. The beautiful truth of the Christian message is that the one person who knows you and me down to our bones, who knows not just the best of us, but the absolute worst of us, also loved us enough to come and die for us. I don't know anyone else who has died for me. And the heart of the Christmas message is that the one who made the universe, who made you and who made me, who made the stars and who made the galaxies, thought that you were worth coming and dying for. So as we think about Christmas, whatever perspective we're coming from this year, maybe let's sort of cut through the tinsel and the gifts and the like pretty little creches and nativity scenes. And think about that offensive and beautiful message at the heart of Christmas. Because the reasons that you might have for not even wondering if it could be true are less plausible than you think. And the one who came to die for love of you is more believable than you might realize. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. We're going to have a Q&A now. Do you need more water? You're fine. The way it's going to work is you just get up and stand behind the microphone. Then I know that there's another question coming. Because if there's not a question coming, I'll just keep asking questions. And that won't be nearly as fun as hearing your questions. So as you're thinking about that and maybe moving to the microphone, let me ask a question. Perhaps trivial, but tell us some Christmas traditions in the McLaughlin household. I mean, I know Santa doesn't make an appearance. You've made that very clear. But other Christmas traditions that you're looking forward to?
Yeah, so our church in Cambridge, Massachusetts, every December, it's actually this coming Saturday, we do a Christmas tree giveaway. So we buy about 200 Christmas trees, and we give them away to people. So we sort of flyer the neighborhood saying, anyone want a free Christmas tree? And then so people come and they can take away, they're quite, I mean, they're taller than you, some of them.
Here we go.
And we have like a live animal petting zoo with goats and sheep and an occasional llama. I don't know that a llama appears in the Christmas narrative, but like we sometimes have a llama.
Third lobster. That
Yeah,
sort of thing.
exactly. And so one of our sort of family traditions is we never buy our own Christmas tree. We wait until all the good Christmas trees are gone, and then we take whatever's like left over is the McLaughlin family Christmas tree.
Oh, there's a lesson there. Thank you. Any questions? Okay, I told you I'll keep asking questions. Some people hear the virgin birth story and they say, it just sounds like so many stories from the Greek world. I mean, Zeus made a lot of young women pregnant. So is this just a copy of that? Maybe a cleaner version, but the same, really?
Yeah, so this is one of the really interesting things. If you sit for a minute with Luke's account of Mary's encounter with this angel, because one of the distinctives of the Jewish people, and Mary is Jewish, is that unlike almost everyone around them, who were polytheists, one way or another, believing all sorts of gods and demigods and semi-demi, hemigods sort of wandering around in the kind of Greco-Roman world and imagination and in the ancient Near East as well. And yet the Jews had this, at the time, very strange belief that there was one God who made the heavens and the earth. And that it wasn't just that, this is their tribal God and other people can have their own tribal gods and that's just fine. The Jews are saying, no, every other God, so-called God, is an idol. And again, it's interesting, one of the things that most of us in the West at least, take for granted, that the few of us are drawn toward polytheism. Like typically we would think, oh, well, there's atheism, agnosticism, and then there's sort of theism, or those are two main options, which really just sort of speaks to the success of Christianity and like normalizing theism. So from a Jewish perspective, it was completely outrageous to think of the one true God of all the universe, who was utterly transcendent, who had a special relationship with his people, but was, this was the God, you couldn't see God and live. The idea that this one true, transcendent, almighty, everlasting God would become human, I mean, that would have been really shocking to Mary's Jewish ears. You have to slightly feel sorry for Mary in that moment, because it's not like, when she gets pregnant, it's not like she can say to people, oh, don't worry, this baby is actually the son of the Most High God. I mean, that would only make things worse. Like, that would sort of add blasphemy charges to her already difficult situation of being pregnant before she's married. Then from a Greek and Roman perspective, and the Jews at the time sort of living in the middle of the Greco-Roman Empire, or I guess not even in the middle, sort of in a backwater, really, of the Greco-Roman Empire, the Romans and the Greeks were completely comfortable with the idea of humans becoming divine and the sort of interplay between the divine and the human. What would have been most shocking to them about the claims of Jesus is that it was this guy who died on a Roman cross who was supposedly the Son of God. Because from their perspective, a really successful emperor or general might have a chance of becoming divine. Like, that was kind of where the interplay between humanity and the divine was, like at the very top of the pile. But this guy, who was in human terms a complete failure, absolutely ridiculous to think that he could be God. And I think if we look at the idea of Jesus being miraculously born of a virgin, you could say, well, yes, there are other stories of gods impregnating women. They're actually radically different from the claims that are being made in the Gospels. Sort of kind of from beginning to end, really, the claims of Jesus are radically different. Oh, we have a question.
Fantastic.
Okay, so as I was listening, I was trying to take mental notes on how to use what you were saying to evangelize, in particular to try to convince my grandparents to love Jesus. So as you were speaking, I was trying to poke holes in what you were saying, as in what could my grandparents come back with? And so when you were specifically talking about the universal morals and how if you trace everything back, it ultimately comes from Christian beliefs. So my kind of poking a hole in that is how do we explain or prove that at the beginning it was Christian beliefs? Like, what if the, Buddhist beliefs, what if those came first and then the Christians took them and then now we believe rape is bad? Does that make sense?
Yeah, great question, yes. And what I would say to that first and foremost is, actually that is true, not with Buddhism, but with Judaism. Because Christianity is not its own sort of independent religion. Christianity is the fulfillment of Judaism. We have a Bible study in our house on Tuesday evenings, and one of our regular members is a young woman who is raised Jewish, isn't a Christian, very sort of interested in what we're saying. And we were talking just this last Tuesday about Jesus' teachings on the poor. The way that Jesus put the poor at the absolute center of kind of moral concern was very much building on Old Testament foundations, building on the Jewish scriptures. Now, it's not building on other foundations, though. So in the world of the time, the Greek and Roman gods, as Tom Holland puts it, cared nothing for the poor. It actually wasn't. We sort of assume that it is morally important to care for poor people, even theoretically, whether people do or not in practice is another question. But we sort of all assume, it's not okay for the strong and the rich and powerful to trample on the weak and the poor and the marginalized. They didn't have that assumption at all. And if you look at some other religious traditions, say, for example, Hinduism has pretty unashamedly a kind of a caste system of there are people who belong at different levels, and that's kind of baked into the religious system. So one of the radical things that Jesus did was actually to, as I say, sort of put the poor and the weak and the marginalized right in the center of the picture, and to say the weak, the strong and the rich and the powerful are on really flimsy sort of theological ground. In fact, it's interesting when Mary has this sort of massive outpouring of praise to God, not long after she's heard about Jesus, she's conceived Jesus kind of while Jesus is like a baby in her womb. And one of the things she says is that she's talking about God bringing down the mighty from their thrones and lifting up the lowly and the weak. And it's sort of stuff that, it feels moral common sense-ish to us because we're so influenced by Christianity, but it really wasn't at the time. And you can't just pull it from any other kind of religious tradition.
That is perfect. Thank you.
Looks like we've got another question. Thank you.
I'm going to ask this. If you don't want to answer it, fine. But there's these three wise men from the East who seem to think something significant's happening. Who told them? Where did they get this message that something was happening in Bethlehem?
I mean, they seem to have seen it in the stars. It's one of the craziest Christmas stories, right? That there are these three wise men or magi from the East who come it's really awkward when you read the story, because they come to Herod, who is the current king of the Jews, and they say, we hear that the king of the Jews has been born and we come to worship him. And it's kind of an awkward thing to say to the king of the Jews that we've come for the other king of the Jews. I don't know how they read that in the stars, but it seems like they did, as far as I can tell from the scriptures. I don't have a wild amount more to say about that. I think, astrology is craziness, but they clearly had some particular revelation that was pointing them to Jesus. And I think we're told that story. It's always interesting to think about why we're told particular stories in the Gospels. Because you could sit down and read any of the Gospels in the length of time it would take you to watch a longer movie. So I saw, apparently it was only the first half of Wicked the other day, and it was 2 hours and 40 minutes long. You could sit down and read Luke's Gospel, the longest one in that time. And they are scrunching together, Jesus' life and ministry and death and resurrection into like a teeny tiny space. So we always have to ask ourselves, why did they choose to tell us the particular stories they did, rather than all the other, including any of the other eyewitness testimony stories that they could have done? So why were we told this story about these wise men from the East coming to worship Jesus? I think one of the reasons is it's an early indication that Jesus is good news, not just for the Jewish people, but actually for everybody from all around the world. It's this sort of, global announcement that's going out about Jesus. And in some ways that it's good news not only for the poor, but also for the highly educated and the kind of wealthy, as these guys seem to be. Now, Jesus is very clear that he had come to preach good news to the poor, sort of first and foremost. But even the wealthier and more educated, more sophisticated can get a piece of the action if they're willing to come.
Is that a question? Great.
Oh, 2 for the price of
We
1.
have 2. Fantastic. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much for speaking. I really appreciated how you sort of traced a lot of these moral and ethical assumptions that we hold, particularly in America and the way that we've been influenced. My question is, as I've done a lot of philosophical work, just figuring out what I believe and why I believe it, is it enough for me to just have a sequence of morals and ethics that I believe are right, that I will act on? Why is there a claim that there should be divinity attached to it outside of my morals?
Yeah, wonderful question. Yeah. So let's imagine for a moment that there is no God. And let's look at our world from that perspective. And here I think actually Richard Dawkins, my fellow countryman, is really helpful. He says the universe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Or you can read Israeli historian Yuval Noah Harari's book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. Global bestseller, quite kind of chunky, interesting book. And Harari is very clear about the fact that what we take to be basic moral common sense is Christian beliefs. So he says, for example, he quotes the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal. He says the Americans got the idea of universal human equality from Christianity, but if we stop believing in a God who gave us souls and all that kind of jazz, like what does it even mean to say that humans are equal? He says the scientific study of Homo sapiens has embarrassingly little to do with human rights and equality. He says human rights are figments of our fertile imaginations. So if we set God aside, we can choose to believe, if we want, that all human beings are fundamentally morally equal, and that we have a responsibility to care for the poor, and that rape is wrong, etc., etc. But it becomes more in the category of, my belief that olives are disgusting. It's really a personal preference, and it's not something that I can say is universally binding for you guys as well. You guys might like olives, and you might think that rape is okay. I'm not saying you do. I'm just saying, like, if we work kind of logically, because if, as Harari puts it, Homo sapiens have no natural rights, just as chimpanzees, hyenas, and spiders have no natural rights, then actually, what are we even doing here? We're making up our ethics. We're choosing to live in a somewhat kind of delusional world. Some coming from an atheist perspective today would even say, your sense that you are a meaningful moral agent is pure imagination. There's an MIT professor called Alan Lightman, who's an agnostic and sort of philosopher, sort of physicist guy. And I'll never forget, a few years ago, I went to an event he was speaking at, and he said this: our consciousness and our self-awareness create the illusion that we have some sort of special ego power, some I-ness, some unique existence, when in reality we're nothing but bones, tissues, gelatinous membranes, electrical impulses, and chemicals. We are stuff like donuts, he said. So when we sort of really sit in the reality of the world, if there is no God, and if, in particular, if Christianity isn't true, we find ourselves in a very kind of scary place, quite frankly. Now you could say, well, okay, so you're just not mature enough to stare the scary place in the face. Stephen Hawking, a famous sort of astrophysicist from the UK, said that believing in an afterlife, it's like a story made up, a fairy tale for people who are afraid of the dark. And that's one possibility, that in fact we live in this extraordinarily bleak universe where we have deluded ourselves that we have any real value, and we're just bones, tissues, gelatinous membranes, electrical impulses, and chemicals, like nothing more than that, nothing more than what science can see, that you and I aren't even really moral agents, and that certainly there are no such things as like universal moral truth claims. But we just need to recognize like how much we lose. It's a bit like, you know, when you play Jenga, I think people think you can kind of inch the Jesus block out of the bottom of the moral tower and build a higher moral tower without it. It's actually more like pulling the pin on a grenade. Like everything goes up in the explosion if you really follow through with that belief. Does that help at all? Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. This is more of a personal question for you than about the lecture specifically. So what decisions, thought processes, and experiences would you recommend for a young woman who wants to someday both have a family and make an impact for the kingdom?
Oh, great question. So what was the first, but what experiences?
Yeah, decisions, thought processes, I can't talk. Decisions, thought processes, and experiences. Yeah.
For somebody who wants to both have a family, a woman who wants to both have a family and make an impact in the world. I think one of the most important things for any of us is to listen to what Jesus said multiple times to his disciples because they didn't get it. And that is that his kingdom works the opposite way around than we imagine. So if you're familiar with the gospel accounts, you might remember that exceedingly embarrassing moment when Jesus tells his disciples he's going to be crucified, and they start arguing about who's the greatest. And Jesus sits them down. He's like, look, I know that people in the world around us, that the kind of important, powerful people lord it over everybody else. And he says, it's not like that in my kingdom. He says, instead, anyone who wants to be great among you must be the least. Whoever wants to be first must be last, and whoever wants to be great must be slave of all. And then he explains why, because even he, the Son of Man, didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. The reason I go back to that often myself, and the reason is it is so easy for us to think, oh, in order to make an impact in the world, I need to sort of basically build my own status one way or another. Like I need to be writing books or winning elections or whatever it is. Like I need some sort of visible impact where people say, oh, look at her, she's making such a big difference in the world. And that's like a deeply ingrained instinct for us. But if what Jesus says is true, then actually some of the most important work being done in the world today is essentially invisible. It's caring for the least seemingly important people around. It's the least kind of glamorous looking work. And it includes the unglamorous work of wiping babies' bottoms and, doing all the sort of mundane things that go into raising a family. That's like profoundly important kingdom building work. Now, I don't think, some people would say, like, that's profoundly important kingdom building work, and that is the work that every Christian woman is called to. And in fact, that needs to be her primary focus, and somebody who is sort of doing what I'm doing, which is like raising children and also doing some other things sort of even sometimes hundreds of miles away from my home is like questionable. I think if we go back to what we see in the scriptures, I think we actually can hold space for all kinds of different work being valid for all kinds of different people. Number one, we need to recognize not everybody is called to be married and to have children. And I think we've completely lost our vision, those of us who are Christians. I think we've lost a meaningful vision for Christian singleness, which is something that's actually like, Paul had a very high view of marriage and he had an even higher view of singleness. So we need to reclaim that. We need to let go of the idea that a woman's like primary first calling is to be a wife and a mother, because actually our first calling is to be a follower of Jesus and a disciple, and some of us will do that as wives and mothers, and others will do that as single people, and both of those things are good. And then I think we just need to do the work that God has put in front of us, whatever that is. Some of the most, for me personally, kind of rewarding work is being able to be in just very on-the-ground gospel conversations with people in my real life up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or across, I suppose, from here. So I just would say seek to be a servant of Jesus. I mean, it's like what Mary said when she receives this incredible announcement from Gabriel that she's going to be the mother of God's only son. And she says, look, I'm the handmaiden, like the slave girl of the Lord. Let it be to me as you have said. And that's the highest honor for a Christian, is to be a slave of Jesus Christ, male or female, busy with our master's work. And he'll build his kingdom one way or the other.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.
Well, perhaps, looks like we've got a question. Thank you.
Enjoyed your speech. Thank you. In your third point about the sophistication, you mentioned that it's pretty remarkable that we're still talking about Jesus 2,000 years, and that 31% of the world population is Christian. But you didn't speak to the 25% that is Muslim. And, I mean, so seems to me they would have the same sort of claims that we do. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, great question. And I often do mention that actually in relation to, because currently it's about 31% of the world identifies as Christian, and I'm not speaking to their like genuine faith or otherwise, but just people who would sort of say that they were Christian. In the next sort of 40 years, that's set to grow most likely to about 32%. So sort of marginal, well, the population of the world is going to be growing, and Christianity is sort of keeping pace and actually slightly outpacing that. For Islam, as you say, about 25% of the world right now identifies as Muslim, and that looks to grow to more like 31% by 2060. So you're making the big, people think that the big question is sort of Christianity or atheism. It's not actually, it's Christianity or Islam as the two kind of biggest options in the world today that people should be seriously considering. Now, why do I think that Christianity has, even just from this one particular vantage point, has the upper hand over Islam? Not only because there are more Christians today than Muslims, but actually because of the sheer diversity of the church. So if you look at Christianity from the very beginning has been a multiracial, multicultural, multi-ethnic movement. And that's something we see around the world today, and we see more and more. So by 2060, about 40% of the world's Christians will be living in sub-Saharan Africa, massive growth in the church in South America, continue to be Christians in Western Europe, where I'm from, at least, some of us, and North America. The growth of the church in China has been extraordinary in recent decades. So you're sort of seeing this genuinely kind of multicultural church. Some other religions, so for example Hinduism, like very strongly tied to certain, India, Nepal, like, and people who've come from those places, like Indonesia, like there's a sort of very there's a tight sort of geographic, racial, ethnic kind of grouping that's aligned with Hinduism. And Islam is not quite at the extreme of Hinduism, but also not in the place of Christianity, that there is more of a sort of narrower demographic, I guess you could say, and more of an explicit program of monoculturalism, actually, from Islam. I love the fact that even the Christian scriptures are in multiple different languages, and Christians are all about translating our scriptures into as many languages as possible, because from a Christian perspective, much as it's lovely to study Greek and Hebrew, actually it's just as valid to read the Bible in any language, and we want people to read the Bible in the language of their own hearts. Muslims would say that if you're not reading the Quran in Arabic, you're not really properly reading it. There's a much more of a sort of tight monocultural view there, and Sharia law obviously kind of having a very sort of specific kind of cultural application. So I think just from those two perspectives, I think it's important to us. I think Islam should be taken very seriously. I think most people in the West who are considering their options, Christianity is going to beat Islam on basically every front. I can defend that in other ways if people wish. But I think we should take Islam more seriously than most people do. But I don't think it's a sort of even competitor with Christianity in terms of delivering all the things that we probably are all hoping for, looking for.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. McLaughlin. Thank you so much for your lecture. So I'm going to go, so you talked a little bit about witnessing to Jews specifically. So I'm going to focus on your problem of Scripture a little bit, about connecting the Christmas story to the Old Testament.
Yeah.
So with that, so one of the most common uses in Matthew is he constantly refers back to the Old Testament about this event is fulfilling this prophecy in the Old Testament. So one of the most famous ones with the Christmas story is that the virgin will give birth. Now with the Old Testament, that verse in there, the word being used for a virgin, you probably know is the word that's usually translated for young woman.
Yeah.
So for that sort of that example, and also just the idea of, okay, the monotheistic faith, the only God in the universe has a son now. That's never been in the Old Testament. So with that, the Jewish argument of saying the Christmas story just completely misunderstands the Jewish faith. How would you reason through that?
Yeah, great. So I'm hearing sort of two questions there, both of which are really good and sort of connected. So I'll speak to the second one. I'll speak to the first one first, but then remind me if I haven't. Maybe you can help me to. I sometimes answer part of a question, then I forget what the other part was. So when it comes to prophecy, as you say, Matthew continually says, "Oh, this is to fulfill what was written in the Old Testament scriptures," and sometimes we look at it and we think, interesting." One example, and perhaps my favorite example in the birth narrative of Matthew, is when Matthew says it is going to be called Jesus, and this was to fulfill what was written in the prophecy where he was going to be called Emmanuel, which means God with us. And you're thinking, well, wait a minute, his name is Jesus, not Emmanuel. So how is that fulfilling this prophecy about Emmanuel? That doesn't make any sense, Matthew. What are you talking about? Until you think about what Matthew's actually saying. Because if Emmanuel, as Matthew explains, means God with us, and the name Jesus means God saves, well, there we have a whole lot of who Jesus is kind of compressed into two names. So how is God saves fulfilling God with us? Well, it's Jesus, the one who is both God and man, who has come to save by representing us to God and bringing heaven and earth back together. I mean, there's so much extraordinary, that packs an extraordinary punch in Matthew. And when it comes to the virgin giving birth and the sort of Isaiah prophecy that Matthew's picking up on there, often when it comes to Old Testament prophecies in the New Testament, it's not that there was no fulfillment of that in the original context. Often there is a limited degree of fulfillment in the original context. But actually, if we only look back to the original fulfillment, we'll find that the prophecy is a sort of, it's a very partial fulfillment. And when you look at some of the extraordinary claims that Isaiah is making, that if Jesus is in fact who he claims to be, and if his kingdom is continuing to grow, and if he will, as he said he would, one day come back again to reign over all the world and to judge the earth, then actually Isaiah's prophecies, a whole slew of Isaiah's prophecies, suddenly make sense in a way that they just weren't fulfilled in anything like that sort of proportion. And I think that's true if we look at all sorts of prophetic texts. So, for example, one of the prophetic texts that Jesus himself sometimes draws on is in, I think it's Daniel 7, when Daniel has a vision of one like a son of man approaching the Ancient of Days and being given this like everlasting, eternal kingdom. Well, who's that talking about? Like, it makes a whole lot of sense if it's talking about Jesus and if his claims about himself are true. If not, then we are certainly waiting for something else, if we're kind of coming from a Jewish perspective. Ask me the other part of the question that I haven't properly answered there.
In Judaism, God doesn't have a son, and then suddenly God has a son.
Well, interestingly, in Judaism, God does have a son. Out of Egypt I called my son is another one of the Old Testament texts that Matthew quotes, because in the Old Testament, Israel is God's son, and we have multiple sort of Old Testament scenarios where God is speaking as a father to a son, to his people, and even to particular sort of kings among his people. And Jesus in the New Testament is absolutely drawing on that. Now, could you have precisely figured out Jesus if you only had the Old Testament scriptures? I don't think so. But when Jesus comes, everything suddenly starts to make a whole new kind of sense.
Thank you. I think we have one last question.
Yeah.
No pressure.
Make it a good one.
I'll do my best. So first off, thank you for the great talk today. I love the theme of this series, which is questioning Christianity. You mentioned about the Muslim population. I definitely see that in my community as well. What I also see is just a lot of people not questioning Christianity. And so my question is, do you have any tactical advice on how we can encourage others to consider Christianity or to solve maybe the problem of apathy that we see today?
Yeah, I think people sometimes think, in order to meet the needs of our modern world, what we need is a whole new strategy. We need a whole new idea, a whole new kind of approach, a whole new whatever. I actually think we need exactly what the first Christians had, which was some very basic things. So we need an offensive amount of love. We need to love our enemies as well as those most like us. We need to be practicing hospitality, inviting people into our homes. We have an epidemic. I mean, it's literally declared an epidemic of loneliness in the US. I think the Surgeon General a couple of years ago sort of formally declared we have an epidemic of loneliness. And so people may be apathetic when it comes to claims of Christianity because they don't realize quite how relevant they are to their own lives. But people are not apathetic when it comes to the question of their deep need for connection and community. And one of the things that's sort of happened in our modern world is we've collapsed all intimacy down into sexual and romantic relationships, and sort of subsequently to parent-child relationships. It's been interesting in the last year or so meeting more and more people sort of becoming Christians out of a sort of secular context in Cambridge. And hearing time and again, young women saying, I haven't really had friends. I've had a series of romantic partners. And I was sometimes even in romantic relationships that I didn't really want to be in, but it was like the only place I was getting any kind of affection. And for them, part of the experience of becoming a Christian has been realizing, oh my goodness, I suddenly have this loving community. There are people who want to know and love me and don't want to come into bed with me. That's not what it's about. And it's one of the things that was remarkable about the Christians from the very beginning, that they shared a common table but not a common bed. The Christian sexual ethics has always been narrow and weird, and Christian community ethics has always been attractive. And I think one of the mistakes that many Christians in the West and sort of churches in the West in particular have made is that we have also bought into the idea that sexual and romantic love is the only sort of show in town. We've baptized it as marriage, and we've said what your purpose is to get married and have children as sort of the nuclear family as the building block of the church. Now, I'm a big fan of the nuclear family. I'm delighted to have a husband and 3 children. But actually, my biological family belongs in the family of the local church, and it's really bad for my family as well as for everybody else if we sort of keep ourselves to ourselves. And so there's something really attractive and surprising about authentic, loving Christian community that I think people are surprisingly interested in. I think of even just this last Tuesday, a young woman who recently become a Christian herself, been bringing a friend who has no Christian background whatsoever, and a friend has said to her, I'm not at all interested in Christianity, I'm just like here for the vibes. And I told my best friend Rachel this, and she was like, yeah, but after a while, she'll realize that the vibes are because of the Christianity. Like, there's a real connection there. And so, yeah, I think we need the basic message of the gospel and the basic practice of Christian love and hospitality. It goes an extraordinarily long way in our modern world.
Wheaton College students can hear Rebecca at a seminar, 8:30 in the morning, am I right, Dan? Up in Wilson, if you want to hear more from Rebecca. We film these Questioning Christianity nights, and we have a great back catalogue now, including topics like, is Christianity sexist? Was the cosmos expecting us? Has Christianity done more harm than good? And so on and so on. If you use the QR code here, you'll be able to go to the website and just watch everything free. You'll also be able to be kept up to date about our next Questioning Christianity. We have the wonderful Peter Weiner with us in spring. He was the speechwriter for 3 presidents. He's a celebrated journalist with the Atlantic and New York Times. And I've asked him to come and talk about, is the media the enemy of God? That'll be fun, so look out for that. Meanwhile, will you please join me in thanking Rebecca McLaughlin?